Did people in the Middle Ages even have a sense of humor? We picture them as serious, solemn, covered in mud and worried about the plague. We think of gray skies, grim-faced knights, and stern monks. Laughter doesn't seem to fit, but that picture is wrong. They laughed a lot. They told jokes that were clever, stupid, dirty, and deeply revealing. They wrote them down in the margins of sacred texts, in formal collections, and in epic poems. These aren't your typical knock-knock jokes. They are windows into a world that was just as strange, complicated, and funny as our own. A joke from the 14th century can tell you more about the fear of doctors than a dozen history books. A simple jest about a farmer can reveal the deep cracks in the feudal system. These people were not so different from us. They worried about money. They were suspicious of authority. They made fun of their spouses. And they really enjoyed a good poop joke. The oldest surviving joke book in the world, the Philogelos or Laughter Lover, was written in Greek in the 4th or 5th century. But its jokes were told and retold, filtering down through the centuries and shaping what people in medieval Europe found funny. Later, in the 15th century, an Italian scholar named Poggio Bracciolini collected hundreds of jokes he and his friends told while working in the Vatican. He called his book the Facetiae. It was a bestseller. It was so popular it was one of the first books to be printed on the new Gutenberg press. People were desperate for a laugh. So what happens when we dust off these old jokes? We find they are not just historical artifacts. Some of them are still genuinely funny. They work because they tap into timeless human truths. They make fun of know-it-alls, liars, and hypocrites. They find humor in life's most awkward and frustrating moments. Let's look at 17 of them. Let's see what they can teach us about a past we thought we knew, and maybe, just maybe, about ourselves. Number 17. What does a doctor really know? Here is the joke. A man goes to see a doctor. He says, "Doctor, when I touch my arm, it hurts. When I touch my leg, it hurts. When I touch my head, my stomach, my chest, they all hurt." The doctor thinks for a moment and says, "I have diagnosed your problem. You have a broken finger." This joke is a classic. You have probably heard a version of it. It's a simple misdirection. But for someone living in the 13th or 14th century, it was more than just a silly gag. It was a joke rooted in pure justifiable terror. Going to a medieval doctor was not a comforting experience. It was often a death sentence. The humor here is gallows humor. It's a way of laughing at a situation that is otherwise terrifying. The man in the joke is a fool, but the real target is the doctor. Medieval medicine was based almost entirely on the theories of ancient Greeks, particularly a man named Galen, who lived in the 2nd century. Galen's ideas were treated like gospel for over 1,000 years. He came up with the theory of the 4 humors. The idea was that the human body was filled with 4 liquids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were healthy, these liquids were in perfect balance. If you got sick, it was because you had too much or too little of one of them. So, a doctor's job was to rebalance your humors. How did they do that? Mostly by removing things from your body. The most common treatment for almost any ailment was bloodletting. Got a fever? You probably have too much hot blood. Let's cut you open and drain some out. Feeling sad, that's an excess of black bile, which is associated with melancholy. Let's give you a powerful laxative to purge it from your system. It was a brutal one-size-fits-all approach. The doctors were not diagnosing a specific illness, they were diagnosing an imbalance. They were treating a theory, not a patient. The joke plays on this. The doctor in the joke actually finds the specific localized problem. He correctly identifies the broken finger. This is the exact opposite of what a real medieval doctor would have done. A real doctor would have likely declared the man had an excess of yellow bile, causing an irritable or choleric distemper throughout his body. He would have prescribed a change in diet, maybe some herbs, and almost certainly a good bleeding. The broken finger would have gone completely unnoticed. The joke is funny because the doctor accidentally practices good modern medicine. He finds the root cause. This was a fantasy. Think about who these doctors were. University-trained physicians were rare and expensive. Most people went to a barber surgeon. These were men who, as the name suggests, would cut your hair and also perform minor surgery. They were the ones who pulled teeth, set broken bones, and did most of the bloodletting. There was no real regulation. A man could literally set up a stall in a market and call himself a surgeon. The church also played a huge role. Sickness was often seen as a punishment from God. So, Treatment involved prayer and pilgrimage just as often as it involved medicine. An influential text from the 11th century, the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum from the medical school in Salerno, Italy, combined practical health advice with moral and religious instruction. Holistic view, but one where science was secondary to faith and tradition. So, when a medieval person heard this joke, they were laughing from a place of deep-seated anxiety. They knew the doctor was probably a quack. They knew his treatments were painful and likely useless. The joke gave them a small moment of power. It allowed them to see the doctor as the fool for a change, not the patient. It was a way of coping with the fact that if you got seriously ill, your best hope was probably not the man with the fancy robes and the jar of leeches. What do we still not know about this? We know what the textbook said, but what did the average doctor really think he was doing? Did he truly believe that bleeding a man near death from a fever was going to save him? Or was it just what he was paid to do? How many folk remedies, passed down through generations of village healers, were actually more effective than official medicine, but were never written down? And what was the real placebo effect of a doctor's visit? Did the sheer authority and ritual of the treatment sometimes make people feel better, even if the medicine itself was poison? Number 16. Are people from the next town over always idiots? Here is the joke. A man from a town known for its fools was carrying a wooden beam. He was struggling to get it through a doorway, he kept trying to carry it through horizontally, and it kept getting stuck. Another man saw his struggle and said, "Why don't you turn it sideways?" The fool was amazed. He thanked the man profusely and invited him home for dinner. The visitor arrived and saw the fool's wife was trying to give a drink of water to a chicken. She was holding the chicken upside down and pouring the water towards its feet. The visitor said, "That's not how you do it. Chickens don't drink like that." The fool got angry and threw the visitor out, shouting, "Get out of my house, you charlatan! You think you know everything!" This joke comes from the Philologus, but the theme is timeless. Every culture has a group of people they make fun of for being stupid. It's the fool from Gotham in medieval England, the Abderites in ancient Greece, or the butt of 1,000 modern blonde jokes or lawyer jokes. It's tribalism in its most basic form. We define who we are by defining who we are not. And often, who we are not is a bunch of idiots who don't even know how to carry a piece of wood. The joke works on two levels. First, there is the simple slapstick humor of the man with the beam and the wife with the chicken. It's a visual gag that is easy to picture. It is funny because it is absurd. But the real punchline is the fool's reaction. He is willing to accept help for his own problem. He sees the logic in turning the beam, but he cannot accept a new idea that challenges something his family or community does. The way his wife gives water to a chicken is their way. It might be wrong, but it's their tradition. The visitor is not just correcting a mistake, he is insulting their customs. This speaks volumes about the medieval world. Life was incredibly local. Most people never traveled more than 10 or 20 miles from the village where they were born. Your entire world was your village, your parish, and maybe the local market town. A stranger from 2 towns over was a genuine foreigner. They talked differently. They had different customs. They were objects of suspicion. This intense localism is captured in documents like the Domesday Book of 1086. It was a massive survey of England ordered by William the Conqueror. It recorded every piece of land, every village, every mill, and every person. It was designed to figure out what taxes could be collected, but it also shows a landscape of tiny, isolated communities. The joke reflects a world where tradition was everything. You farmed the way your father farmed. You baked bread the way your mother baked it. You believed what the village priest told you to believe. Innovation was suspect. New ideas were dangerous. The fool in the joke represents this mindset. He can accept a simple mechanical solution to a problem he is facing right now. He cannot accept a challenge to his worldview. The visitor, the outsider with his better way of doing things, is a threat. The humor comes from the hypocrisy. The fool calls the visitor a charlatan who thinks he knows everything immediately after benefiting from that visitor's knowledge. We, the audience, see the ridiculousness of his position, but for a medieval listener, it might have hit closer to home. They would have recognized the stubborn, proud villager who refuses to change his ways. They might have even seen a bit of themselves in him. The joke reinforces the idea that we are the smart ones, and the people over there are the stubborn fools. It's a way of building community identity through ridicule. Historian Martha Baylis, in her work on medieval humor, talks about how jokes were often used to enforce social norms. By laughing at the fool, you are learning the right way to behave. You learn that stubbornness in the face of logic is foolish. But you also learn that challenging local customs can get you thrown out of the house. It's a surprisingly complex social lesson wrapped in a simple joke. It's about the tension between progress and tradition, between the insider and the outsider, a tension that defined much of medieval life. So what are the big unanswered questions here? We know these fool town jokes were popular, but did the people from those towns ever get to tell their own jokes back? Did they have their own stories where the people from the next town were the idiots? How much of this humor was good-natured ribbing, and how much of it was genuinely mean-spirited prejudice that could spill over into actual conflict? And when a person moved from one village to another, how long did it take before they stopped being the outsider and were allowed to be in on the joke? Number 15. Why is it funny when a holy man sins? Here's a joke from Poggio Bracciolini's Facetiae, collected around 1451. A Franciscan friar was preaching to a crowd in a town square. He went on and on about the evils of sin and the importance of giving to the poor, meaning the church. He held up a crucifix and said, "I have traveled with this sacred relic for 10 years, living a life of poverty and prayer." From a man in the crowd shouted, "That's not the same crucifix you had last week. I saw you buy that one at the market yesterday." The friar, without missing a beat, leaned in and whispered to the man, "Quit, you fool! Did you really think I'd be carrying the same one for 10 years? It would have fallen apart by now." This joke is all about hypocrisy, and nobody was a bigger target for accusations of hypocrisy in the Middle Ages than the clergy. The church was the single most powerful institution in Europe. It was immensely wealthy. It controlled vast amounts of land. Its leaders, the bishops and abbots, lived like princes. Yet, its central message was one of humility, poverty, and spiritual devotion. This created a massive gap between what the church preached and what people saw every day. The friar in the joke is a perfect example. The Franciscan order, founded by Saint Francis of Assisi in the early 13th century, was a mendicant order. This means they were supposed to be beggars. They took vows of poverty and were meant to survive on the charity of others while they preached to the common people. But by the 15th century, when this joke was being told, many people saw the friars as greedy and corrupt. They were seen as con men, using religion to fleece the poor. The joke works because the friar doesn't even try to deny the accusation. He doesn't defend his holiness. Instead, he admits to the deception and, in doing so, makes the heckler his accomplice. His whispered response, "Quiet, you fool," turns the situation on its head. He is not a holy man caught in a lie. He is a practical professional who has been found out by an amateur. The humor lies in his shamelessness. He has completely abandoned any pretense of piety. He is a salesman, and his product is salvation. This kind of anti-clerical humor was everywhere. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in England in the late 14th century, created some of the most famous corrupt churchmen in literature. In the Canterbury Tales, you have the pardoner. His job is to sell pardons for sins, official church documents that were supposed to reduce time in purgatory. But Chaucer's pardoner openly admits to his audience that he is a complete fraud. He preaches against greed while being consumed by it himself. He carries fake relics, like a pillowcase he claims is a piece of the Virgin Mary's veil, and uses them to trick poor villagers into giving him their money. He is a terrifying and hilarious character. Jokes like this were a way for ordinary people to push back against the immense power of the church. You couldn't openly challenge a bishop. You could be excommunicated or even tried for heresy. But you could tell a joke. Laughter was a safe form of rebellion. It pointed out the corruption without calling for a revolution. It was a way of saying, "We see you. We know what you are doing." This undercurrent of resentment and cynicism would eventually boil over in the 16th century with the Protestant Reformation, but the seeds of it were sown in jokes and stories told for hundreds of years before Martin Luther. People were tired of being told how to live by men who didn't follow their own rules. The joke also reveals something about the nature of faith. The man in the crowd is not questioning God. He is not questioning the importance of the crucifix as a symbol. He is questioning the authenticity of this specific object, and by extension, the man holding it. It was an age of relics. Churches across Europe claimed to have pieces of the true cross, bones of the apostles, or vials of the Virgin Mary's milk. The trade in these objects, both real and fake, was enormous. People went on long, dangerous pilgrimages to see them. Faith was a very tangible physical thing. This joke pokes a hole in that. It suggests that maybe it's not the object that matters, but the sales pitch. So, what are the unanswered questions that linger? How did high ranking church officials really feel about this kind of humor? Did they see it as a harmless way for people to let off steam, or did they genuinely fear it as a threat to their authority? We know that some preachers, like the famous orator Bernardino of Siena, actually used humor in their own sermons to keep the crowd's attention. So, where was the line between acceptable and heretical laughter? And did the average person telling this joke still go to confession with a friar the next day, or did the humor create a permanent sense of distance and distrust? Number 14. What is the secret to a happy marriage? Here is a classic medieval tale. A man suspects his wife is cheating on him. He pretends to leave on a long journey, but instead hides in a chest in their bedroom to spy on her. Soon, her lover arrives. The wife and her lover have a nice meal and then start to get comfortable. The wife says, I feel guilty. I just sold that big chest over there for 30 pieces of silver, and I never told my husband. I should go tell him. She goes to the chest and pretends to be talking to her husband far away. My dear husband, I have sinned. I sold your chest without asking. From inside the chest, the husband shouts, Do not worry, my dear wife. You are forgiven. It was an old chest, and we need the money. The wife's lover is astonished that her husband's voice could travel so far. The wife, of course, has already been paid the 30 pieces of silver by her lover for her discretion. This is more of a short story than a one-liner, but it fits into a very popular genre of medieval humor known as the fabliaux. These were short, funny, and often very raunchy poems that were popular in France from the 12th to the 14th centuries. They almost always involve trickery, adultery, and clever characters outsmarting dumb ones. The heroes of the fabliaux are often women and priests who use their wits to get what they want. The joke here is not just that the wife is cheating, it's that she is so incredibly clever about it. She doesn't just fool her husband, she makes him an active participant in his own deception. He thinks he is catching her in the act, but he is actually giving her the perfect alibi. The husband is a classic trope, the jealous, clueless fool. The wife is the hero of the story. She is resourceful, quick-thinking, and in complete control of the situation. The audience is supposed to laugh at the husband's stupidity and admire the wife's cleverness. This might seem surprising. We often think of medieval women as powerless and oppressed. And in many ways, they were. Legally, a woman was the property of her father and then her husband. Marriages, especially among the upper classes, were usually arranged for political or economic reasons. Love was not a major consideration. A woman's primary duty was to produce a male heir. But these jokes show us a different side of the story. They show that, despite their legal disadvantages, women were not seen as weak or stupid. In the world of popular humor, they were often the smartest people in the room. These stories were a kind of fantasy. They presented a world turned upside down, where the weak outsmarted the powerful. A peasant could trick a knight, a student could fool his professor, and a wife could run circles around her husband. This was a form of wish fulfillment. For the men in the audience, it was perhaps a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of a clever wife. For the women, it must have been a satisfying story of a woman taking control of her own life. And Chaucer's Wife of Bath from the Canterbury Tales is the ultimate embodiment of this character. She has been married 5 times. She is bold, bawdy, and completely unapologetic about using her sexuality to control her husbands. She argues passionately that her experience in marriage makes her more of an expert on the subject than any celibate male cleric. She is a character who refuses to be silenced or controlled. She is, in many ways, the hero of a fabliau brought to life. This joke also tells us something about privacy in the Middle Ages. The idea of hiding in a chest seems silly, but homes were not the private spaces we think of today. A typical peasant family might live in a one-room house, sharing that space with their animals. Even in a castle, rooms were multi-purpose. A bedroom was also a reception room. Servants slept on the floor at the foot of their master's bed. True privacy was a luxury most people could not afford. So the idea of a husband being able to hide and spy on his wife in their own bedroom was not as far-fetched as it sounds. So what are the big mysteries left? These stories were almost certainly written by men, mostly educated clerics. So were they genuinely celebrating female cleverness, or were these jokes a form of male anxiety about being cuckolded and made to look like a fool? Did women have their own separate tradition of jokes and stories about clueless husbands that just never got written down? And how did the official church view of marriage as a sacred and unbreakable sacrament coexist with this popular culture that treated adultery as a clever and often hilarious game? Number 13. What happens when you argue with a fool? Here's the joke. A scholar and a boatman are in a boat. The scholar, wanting to show off his intelligence, says to the boatman, "My good man, have you ever studied grammar?" The boatman says no. "Then you have wasted half your life," says the scholar. A few minutes later, the scholar asks, "Have you ever studied philosophy?" The boatman again says no. "Then you have wasted half your life," the scholar repeats. Suddenly, a storm blows in. The boat is tossed by the waves and begins to sink. The boatman turns to the scholar and asks, "Have you ever learned to swim?" The scholar says no. "Then," says the boatman, "you have wasted your whole life." This is another timeless joke. It's the classic conflict between book smarts and street smarts, between theory and practice. It is a story that has been told in 1,000 different ways, but the medieval version has a particular bite to it. The scholar or scholasticus was a common stock character in jokes, especially in the Philologus. He was the absent-minded professor, the man so lost in his own thoughts that he couldn't function in the real world. The joke is a direct attack on the kind of education that was common in medieval universities. Starting around the 11th and 12th centuries, universities began to pop up across Europe in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. The main method of teaching was called scholasticism. It was a system based on logic and reason, trying to reconcile the philosophy of ancient thinkers like Aristotle with Christian theology. It involved a lot of memorization, debate, and the study of very abstract concepts. The scholar in the joke, with his questions about grammar and philosophy, is a product of this system. He believes that his kind of knowledge is the only kind that matters. The boatman represents the other 99% of the population. Most people in the Middle Ages were illiterate. Their knowledge was not from books. It was practical, passed down from generation to generation. A farmer knew the soil, a blacksmith knew metal, and a boatman knew the water. This was knowledge that could keep you alive. The joke argues that this practical knowledge is not just useful, it is superior to the abstract knowledge of the scholar. What good is knowing philosophy if you are about to drown? The humor comes from the sudden and violent reversal of fortunes. For the whole journey, the scholar is in charge. He is smug and condescending. The boatman is a humble, ignorant servant. But when the storm hits, the power dynamic flips completely. The scholar's knowledge is useless. The boatman's skill is the only thing that matters. The final line, "You have wasted your whole life," is the perfect punchline. It takes the scholar's own arrogant words and turns them back on him with deadly force. This joke would have been especially popular with the rising merchant and artisan classes in medieval towns and cities. These were people who, like the boatman, had practical skills. They were carpenters, weavers, merchants, and sailors. They were often uneducated in the formal university sense, but they were smart, successful, and increasingly wealthy. They were the engine of the medieval economy. A joke like this would have validated their own life experience. It said that their practical skills were just as valuable, if not more so, than the fancy Latin of the university men. The scholar in the joke is also funny because he is so predictable. He can only see the world through the lens of his own education. This is a form of intellectual blindness. A famous collection of stories, the Gesta Romanorum, compiled in the late 13th or early 14th century, is full of tales that were used by preachers in their sermons. Many of these stories have a simple moral, and the moral of a tale like this one would be about the sin of pride. The scholar is guilty of superbia, the worst of the 7 deadly sins. His downfall is a direct result of his arrogance. The joke is not just a joke, it's a moral lesson. What do we still wonder about? Did university students and professors tell these jokes about themselves? Was there a culture of self-deprecating humor within the academic world? We know they played pranks and wrote satirical poems, so it seems likely. How did the uneducated majority really feel about the universities? Was it purely resentment, or was there also a sense of awe and respect for the world of learning? And did a joke like this ever actually change anyone's mind? Or did it just reinforce the prejudices that people already had about the pointy-headed intellectuals? Number 12. How do you sell a broken horse? Here is the joke. A man was trying to sell a horse. A potential buyer came to look at it and said, "Why is the horse breathing so heavily from its sides?" The seller said, "Oh, don't worry about that. He is just very proud. He has so much spirit that it shows in his breathing." The buyer then said, "But why does he have a bald patch on his back?" The seller replied, "He is a very clean horse. He rubs himself against the stable wall so much that the hair has worn off." The buyer, still skeptical, said, "But his head is all swollen and scabby." The seller, without hesitation, said, "That's because he is so strong. He keeps banging his head on the manger." The buyer finally said, "All right, I'll take him. Not because I believe a word you're saying, but because I am fascinated by your incredible ability to come up with excuses." This joke, found in various forms across medieval jest books, is a masterclass in salesmanship and cynicism. It's funny because of the escalating absurdity of the seller's lies. Each excuse is more ridiculous than the last. The horse is clearly a wreck. It is sick, worn out, and probably on its last legs. But the seller spins every single flaw into a virtue. Its heavy breathing is pride. Its bald patch is cleanliness. Its swollen head is a sign of strength. The real punchline, however, is the buyer's reaction. He doesn't buy the horse because he is fooled. He buys it because he appreciates the art of the lie. In a strange way, he is buying the story, not the horse. It's a joke for a world where everyone knows that everyone else is probably trying to cheat them. It's a joke for a society that has a healthy dose of cynicism about human nature. This was the reality of the medieval marketplace. There was no consumer protection. There were no lemon laws. The principle was caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. When you went to a market or a fair, you were entering a world of sharp dealing and clever cons. A baker might put sawdust in his bread to save on flour. A wine seller might mix cheap Spanish wine with expensive French wine. A weaver might stretch his cloth to make it seem longer than it was. Guilds and town authorities tried to regulate these things. They had official weights and measures. They had inspectors. The punishment for being caught could be severe, from a fine to being put in the stocks for public humiliation. The records of medieval towns are filled with cases of people being punished for this kind of fraud. A London baker named John of Stratford, for example, was punished in 1327 for selling a loaf of bread that was underweight. He was drawn on a hurdle through the streets of the city with the loaf tied around his neck. But despite these efforts, cheating was rampant. This joke is a reflection of that reality. The audience would have recognized the fast-talking salesman immediately. They had all met someone like him. They had all been in a situation where they knew they were being lied to, but the lies were so creative that they were almost admirable. The joke is a celebration of the con artist. He is not a villain, he is a performer. His lies are a kind of folk art. The horse itself is also important. In the medieval world, a horse was a major investment. For a knight, it was a weapon of war. For a farmer, it was a vital piece of agricultural equipment. For a merchant, it was a means of transport. A good horse was a status symbol. A bad horse was a financial disaster. The health of a horse was a constant source of anxiety. There were books written on the subject, like Jordanus Rufus's 13th century work De Medicina Equirum, on the medicine of horses, which was the standard veterinary text for centuries. So the act of buying a horse was a high-stakes transaction. Getting cheated was a serious matter. This joke takes that serious situation and makes it funny by focusing on the personality of the swindler rather than the plight of the victim. So what are the big unknowns? We have the official records of fraud and punishment, but how many people got away with it? Was being a clever cheat seen as a flaw, or was it a respected, if unofficial, skill in a tough world? We know about the rules, but what was the real day-to-day culture of the marketplace? And was the buyer in the joke a fool for buying a broken horse, or was he a kind of connoisseur, a man who was willing to pay for a good performance, even if the product was worthless? Number 11. Can a ghost be a landlord? Here is the joke. A man rented a house that was said to be haunted. On the first night, a ghost appeared. The ghost moaned and wailed, "I have been here for 700 years. The man, who was in bed, looked up and said, "Well, could you please close the door? There's a terrible draft." This is a joke about being unflappable. It's a story about a man who is so practical and down to earth that even a terrifying supernatural event cannot shake him. The humor comes from the complete mismatch between the ghost's dramatic announcement and the man's mundane response. The ghost is expecting terror. It has been practicing its routine for 7 centuries. Instead, it gets a complaint about the heating bill. The joke tells us a lot about the medieval relationship with the supernatural. We tend to think of medieval people as being terrified of ghosts, demons, and spirits. And they were. The world was seen as a battleground between the forces of God and the forces of Satan. And demons were real. They could possess you. Witches could cast spells on your cattle. The night was a dangerous time, full of malevolent spirits. The church taught that ghosts were usually the souls of the dead, trapped in purgatory and forced to walk the earth until they had atoned for their sins. They might appear to ask for prayers or to warn the living, but this joke shows a different attitude. It shows that people could also be very matter-of-fact about the supernatural. Well, ghosts were just another part of the world, like bad weather or noisy neighbors. If you had a ghost, you dealt with it. The man in the joke is not a skeptic. He doesn't say ghosts aren't real. He accepts the ghost's presence. He just doesn't see why a 700-year-old ghost shouldn't have the common courtesy to close the door behind him. This practical attitude is found in a lot of medieval literature. There are many stories of saints who have very casual conversations with demons. There are tales of ordinary people who trick the devil into doing chores for them. In the famous 12th century text, the Dialogue on Miracles by Caesarius of Heisterbach, a Cistercian monk, there are countless ghost stories. Some are terrifying, but others are almost bureaucratic. A ghost appears to a priest to ask him to say a certain number of masses so he can get out of purgatory. It's a transaction. The supernatural world had its own rules and regulations, just like the earthly one. The joke also taps into the timeless frustrations of being a renter. The man is cold. He is worried about a draft. These are practical, immediate problems. A ghost from another dimension is an abstract problem. A cold draft is happening right now. His response is the ultimate expression of pragmatism. He is not going to let a little thing like a restless spirit from the 8th century distract him from the important business of getting a comfortable night's sleep. This kind of dry, understated humor is very common in Northern European cultures. You see its descendants in British comedy and Scandinavian deadpan. It's the humor of people who live in a harsh climate and have learned not to get too excited about things. A ghost appears? Fine. Just don't let the cold air in. What are the questions that remain? How common was the belief that you could just boss a ghost around? Most official church doctrine would suggest that you should be praying, not giving orders. So was this joke a form of subtle rebellion against the official view of the supernatural? We have many stories about ghosts collected by monks and theologians, but what were the ghost stories that ordinary people told each other around the fire? How different were they? And did anyone ever try to charge a ghost rent for haunting their property? Number 10. What do you do when you run out of wine? Here is a story from the Facetiae. A group of friends are having a dinner party. The host is known to be a bit stingy. The wine runs out early in the evening. There is an awkward silence. One of the guests, trying to save the situation, looks up at the ceiling and says, "My, what a beautifully carved beam that is. It's magnificent." Another guest, understanding the game, adds, "Yes, and look at the craftsmanship on that wall tapestry. Truly a work of art." A third guest chimes in, "The floor tiles are exquisite. I've never seen such a pattern." The host, beaming with pride at all the compliments, still does not offer any more wine. Finally, the first guest says, "All these things are wonderful, but if we had some wine, they would look even better." This joke is a beautiful little piece of social commentary. It's all about the delicate art of being a good guest and the miserable failure of being a bad host. The guests are in a difficult position. They are thirsty, but it would be incredibly rude to just demand more wine. Hospitality in the Middle Ages was a serious social obligation. A good host was expected to be generous. A feast was a way of displaying your wealth and status. To run out of food or drink was a social disgrace. The Icelandic sagas, for example, are full of stories where a failure of hospitality leads to a bloody feud. The guests in the joke are trying to be polite. They use a classic passive-aggressive strategy. They start praising the host's house. The compliments are a subtle hint. They are trying to put the host in a good mood, to remind him of his duty to be generous and magnificent, just like his house. It's a beautifully indirect way of asking for a drink. The joke is in the tension. Will the host get the hint? The audience is waiting to see if the strategy will work. Of course it doesn't. The host is either too cheap or too stupid to understand what is happening. He just soaks up the compliments, completely missing the point. This makes him a fool. He is failing at the most basic duty of a host. The humor is in his social cluelessness. The final line is the punchline. The first guest finally gives up on subtlety and just comes right out with it. If we had some wine, they would look even better. It's a brilliant line because it's still framed as a compliment, but the message is now impossible to ignore. It's the moment where politeness finally breaks down in the face of thirst. This joke gives us a glimpse into the social rituals of the medieval upper classes. These are the kinds of people who would have, wall tapestries and carved beams. They are part of a world where conversation was a kind of game, full of hidden meanings and subtle jabs. This is the world of courtly manners which were becoming increasingly elaborate during the Renaissance when Poggio was collecting these jokes. There were books of etiquette like Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier, published in 1528, but reflecting the culture of the late 15th century, laid out the complex rules of how to behave in polite society. This joke is a small, funny example of those rules in action. The joke also highlights the importance of wine. Wine was not just a drink, it was a staple of the diet, a sign of civilization, and a central part of the Christian sacrament. The quality and quantity of the wine you serve said a lot about you. The great vineyards of France, especially Burgundy and Bordeaux, were already famous. The wine trade was a huge part of the European economy. A man who was stingy with his wine was not just being cheap, he was signaling that he was a person of low status and poor character. What do we still not know? Were there established, well-known code phrases for asking for more to drink, like the compliments in the joke? Was this a common social game that everyone understood? Like, how would this joke have been different if it were about peasants drinking ale in a tavern instead of wealthy men drinking wine in a dining hall? And what was the worst possible thing a host could do? Was running out of wine worse than serving bad food or having a boring conversation? Number 9. How does a good deed get punished? Here is the joke. A man saw a wolf caught in a trap. Feeling pity for the animal, he set it free. The wolf immediately turned on him and was about to eat him. The man cried, "This is unjust. You are repaying my good deed with evil." The wolf said, "This is the way of the world. Good deeds are always punished." The man disagreed, and they decided to ask 3 others for their judgment. First, they asked the horse. The horse said, "When I was young and strong, my master fed me well. Now that I'm old and useless, he works me to death and beats me. The wolf is right." Next, they asked an ox. The ox said, "For years, I pulled my master's plow and helped him grow rich. Now he is going to take me to the butcher. The wolf is right." Finally, they saw 2 boys. One was carrying the other on his back across a river. They asked the boy being carried for his opinion. He said, "I cannot judge such a difficult matter from here. Please, wolf, hold my friend for a moment so I can get a better look." The wolf, wanting to appear fair, let go of the man and held the boy. The man and the first boy immediately ran away, leaving the other boy to be eaten by the wolf. This is a dark joke. It's a cynical fable that ends with a child being eaten. It comes from a tradition of animal fables that goes back to Aesop in ancient Greece. These stories were incredibly popular in the Middle Ages. The most famous collection was the Reynard the Fox cycle, a series of tales about a trickster fox who constantly outwits his more powerful enemies. These stories were not cute children's tales. They were sharp, satirical commentaries on human society with all its greed, stupidity, and injustice. The joke starts with a simple moral problem. Should you help a dangerous creature? The man's compassion gets him into trouble. The wolf's argument that the world is an unjust place where good deeds are punished is a very bleak and cynical worldview. But the joke seems to prove him right. The horse and the ox, 2 symbols of loyal service, have both been betrayed by their human masters. Their testimony paints a grim picture of human nature. It seems that the man is doomed. The twist comes with the introduction of the 2 boys. They represent human cleverness. They are tricksters, like Reynard the Fox. The boy's solution is brilliant. He doesn't argue about justice or morality. He uses the wolf's own pride and desire to seem reasonable against it. The wolf falls for the trick, and the original victim escapes. But the story doesn't end there. The punchline is that an innocent child is sacrificed. The man who is saved doesn't try to save his savior. He just runs. The final message is even more cynical than the wolf's. It's not just that the world is unjust, it's that in a cruel world, the only way to survive is to be more cruel and more clever than everyone else. It's a story where nobody is good. The man is a fool, the wolf is a predator, and the boy is a ruthless manipulator. This kind of dark realism would have resonated with a medieval audience. Life was precarious. Famine, war, and disease were constant threats. The legal system was often arbitrary and favored the rich and powerful. People saw injustice every day. A story like this, where cleverness triumphs over brute force, but with a morally ambiguous cost, felt true to life. It was a world where you had to be smart to survive, and sometimes that meant making tough, even cruel, choices. This is very different from the official morality taught by the church, which emphasized virtues like charity, mercy, and self-sacrifice. These fables presented an alternative, more worldly wisdom. It was the wisdom of the peasant, not the priest. It was about how to get by in a fallen world, not how to get into the next one. The French historian Jacques Le Goff wrote about the two competing cultures of the Middle Ages: the official, Latin-based culture of the church and the universities, and the vernacular, folk culture of the common people. This joke is a product of that folk culture. So, what are the big questions that this joke leaves us with? Who was the original audience for these kind of brutally cynical stories? Were they told to children? And if so, what kind of lessons were they supposed to be learning? We tend to think of fables as having a clear moral, but the moral here is very murky. Is it don't help wolves, or is it be prepared to sacrifice an innocent person to save yourself? And how did people reconcile this kind of ruthless pragmatism with their Christian faith? Did they live in two separate mental worlds, one for Sunday and one for the rest of the week? Number 8. What is the stupidest thing a person can do? Here is a joke from the Philogelos. A man wanted to teach his donkey not to eat so much. So he stopped feeding it. A few days later, the donkey died. The man said, "What a tragedy." Just when he had finally learned not to eat, he died. This is a perfect example of a joke about a scholasticus, or an intellectual fool. It's a joke about someone who is so committed to his own theory that he completely ignores the evidence right in front of him. The man has a hypothesis: I can teach my donkey to live without food. He conducts an experiment. The experiment fails in the most catastrophic way possible. But instead of admitting his theory was wrong, he blames the donkey for dying just before the moment of success. The humor is in the man's spectacular stupidity. His logic is so twisted and self-serving that it becomes absurd. We, the audience, can see the obvious truth: he starved his donkey to death. He is the only one who cannot see it. This kind of willful ignorance is a timeless source of comedy. We laugh at people who are confidently and spectacularly wrong. The joke is also a parody of the scientific method, or at least a proto-scientific method. The man is observing, hypothesizing, and experimenting, but he is a terrible scientist. He is blinded by his desired outcome. He wants to save money on donkey food, so he convinces himself that it's possible for a donkey to live on nothing. This is a jab at anyone who lets their desires cloud their judgment, whether they are a philosopher, a theologian, or just a cheapskate donkey owner. In the medieval context, this joke could also be seen as a critique of a certain kind of intellectual arrogance. The scholastic philosophy, with its intricate logical debates, could sometimes seem completely detached from reality. There were famous debates about things like how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. To an outsider, this could look like a pointless mental exercise, a game of logic that had nothing to do with the real world. The man with the donkey is an extreme version of this. He has a theory that is logically consistent in his own head, but it is fatally at odds with the biological reality of donkeys. The donkey is also a key part of the joke. Donkeys in folklore are often stubborn, but they are also symbols of humility and hard work. This donkey is a silent, suffering victim of its owner's foolishness. Its death is a tragic and completely unnecessary consequence of a bad idea. There is a real pathos to the joke, which makes the man's final comment even more outrageously funny. He doesn't see a tragedy. He sees an inconvenient interruption of his important research. This joke structure, where a fool reports the disastrous results of his own stupidity as if it were a surprising scientific finding, is still used today. It's a classic comedic template. It reminds us that intellectual folly is not a new invention. People have been proudly and loudly missing the point for thousands of years. The historian Barbara Tuchman, in her book The March of Folly, explored how governments throughout history have pursued policies that were contrary to their own interests. The man with the donkey is a small, domestic example of this phenomenon. He is a one-man march of folly. So what are the lingering mysteries? We know the Scholasticus was a stock character. But was he based on a general stereotype, or were there famous real-life intellectuals who were known for their absent-mindedness and lack of common sense. How much of the humor about intellectuals was driven by class resentment, the feeling of the uneducated that the educated were a bunch of useless dreamers? And did these jokes ever function as a genuine intellectual critique, a way of reminding scholars and philosophers that their theories needed to be grounded in the real world? Number 7. How do you get out of paying a debt? Here's the joke. A man owed money to an innkeeper. The innkeeper kept demanding payment. One day, the man came to the innkeeper with a bag of money and said, "I have the money I owe you, but I will only give it to you if you grant me one request." The innkeeper, eager to be paid, agreed. The man then said, "My request is that you do not ask me for the money." This is a logic puzzle disguised as a joke. It's a simple, elegant paradox. If the innkeeper agrees to the request, he can't get his money. If he doesn't agree, he also can't get his money, because the man will only pay him if he agrees. The debtor has trapped him in a catch-22 situation. He has used the innkeeper's own greed and the rules of formal agreement against him. The joke is funny because it's so clever. It's a purely intellectual kind of humor. The pleasure is in seeing how the man uses language and logic to get out of his obligation. He is a verbal acrobat. This is a very different kind of humor from a simple slapstick or a dirty joke. It's a joke that would have appealed to the educated, to the university students and clerics who were trained in formal logic and rhetoric. The study of logic, based on the works of Aristotle, was a cornerstone of medieval university education, and students learned how to construct arguments, how to spot fallacies, and how to use language with precision. This joke is like a miniature logic exercise. The joke also reflects a society that was becoming increasingly legalistic. As trade and commerce grew in the later Middle Ages, so did the need for contracts and formal agreements. People were making deals, lending money, and taking each other to court. A person's word was their bond, but a cleverly worded contract could be even better. The man in the joke is essentially creating a verbal contract that is designed to self-destruct. The setting of the inn is also important. Inns and taverns were the hubs of medieval social life. They were places where people from different social classes mixed. Merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and students all passed through the local inn. They were places of business, but also places of pleasure and danger. They were notorious for gambling, fighting, and prostitution. The innkeeper was often a powerful figure in the local community, but also one who was constantly dealing with rowdy and untrustworthy customers. The struggle between the innkeeper and the debtor is a classic conflict. This joke is a great example of a wit combat story. The hero doesn't use a sword, he uses his brain. He defeats his opponent with a clever phrase. This kind of story was very popular. It celebrated the power of intelligence over brute force or wealth. It's a fantasy of empowerment for anyone who felt that their only real asset was their mind. What are the big questions we still have about this? Was this kind of logical puzzle a common form of entertainment like riddles? We know riddles were very popular from texts like the Anglo-Saxon Exeter book. Were paradoxes like this part of the same tradition? How did the growth of a money-based economy and the concept of debt change the way people told stories and jokes? And in a real-life situation, if a debtor tried a trick like this, how would a medieval court have ruled? Would they have appreciated the cleverness, or would they have just told him to pay up? Number 6, what's hiding in the soup? Here is the joke. A traveler at an inn ordered a bowl of soup. He took one spoonful and called the innkeeper over. "Innkeeper, come taste this soup," he said. The innkeeper was flustered. "Is something wrong with it, sir? Is it too cold?" "Just taste the soup," the traveler insisted. "Is it too salty?" the innkeeper asked, worried. "Will you please just taste the soup?" the traveler demanded. The innkeeper finally gave in. "All right, I'll taste it. Where's the spoon?" The traveler replied, "Aha, this is one of the all-time great restaurant jokes. It has been told for centuries in countless variations, but imagine hearing it for the first time in a world without health inspectors or online reviews." The joke is a perfect little drama. It builds suspense. We know something is wrong with the soup, but we don't know what. The innkeeper's growing panic is funny. He is imagining all the terrible things that could be wrong. The traveler's insistence is also funny. He is calm and determined. He is in control. The punchline, aha, is brilliant. It reveals that the problem was not the quality of the soup, but the absence of a spoon. The traveler wasn't complaining, he was trying to solve a problem. The whole conversation has been a misunderstanding. The innkeeper thought he was dealing with a customer complaint. The traveler was just trying to get a utensil. The humor comes from the release of tension and the realization that we, the audience, have been led down the wrong path, just like the innkeeper. This joke tells us something about the experience of travel and dining in the Middle Ages. Inns were often dirty and uncomfortable, the food could be questionable, a traveler was at the mercy of the host. You ate what you were given, and you hoped for the best. The fear of being cheated or served bad food was very real. The innkeeper in the joke immediately assumes the worst because he knows that complaints are common and often justified. The detail about the spoon is also significant. While knives were common personal items that people often carried with them, spoons were less so. A host would be expected to provide them. The absence of a spoon is a sign of a poorly run establishment. It's a small detail, but it speaks volumes about the innkeeper's lack of care. A study of medieval cutlery by archaeologists shows that spoons were typically made of wood or horn for the common people, and silver or pewter for the wealthy. Finding a spoon in your soup was probably less of a concern than finding something else. Food adulteration was a constant worry. For example, a common trick was for innkeepers to pass off old, tough meat as fresh by over spicing it. Spices, which came from the East and were incredibly expensive, could be used to hide a multitude of sins. The historian Paul Friedman has written about how the desire for spices drove a huge amount of medieval trade and exploration. It also drove a lot of culinary fraud. The joke is ultimately about communication. It's a funny example of how two people can be having the same conversation but be talking about completely different things. The traveler is being indirect. He could have just said, "I need a spoon." But instead, he creates a little theatrical performance. Why? Perhaps he is just a bit of a troublemaker, or perhaps he has learned from experience that a direct request might be ignored, but a bit of drama gets a faster response. So, what are the things we still don't know? How did a traveler in the Middle Ages actually complain about bad service? What were the social conventions? We have a few guidebooks for pilgrims, like the one from the 12th century for those traveling to Santiago de Compostela, which warns about specific inns and regions known for cheating travelers. But what about the face-to-face interactions? Was humor and indirectness, like in the joke, a common strategy? And what was the weirdest thing anyone ever actually found in their medieval soup? Number 5. Who is the king of the birds? Here is the joke. The birds decided to choose a king. They agreed that the one who could fly the highest would be their ruler. The mighty eagle soared up, higher and higher, leaving all the other birds far below. When he could go no higher, he called out, "I am the king." But then, a tiny wren, who had been hiding in the eagle's feathers, flew up just a little bit higher and chirped, "No, I am." This is a fable that teaches a simple lesson: brains over brawn. The eagle represents power, strength, and majesty. He is the obvious choice for king. The wren is small, weak, and seemingly insignificant. But the wren wins, not through strength, but through cleverness. It uses the eagle's own power to achieve its goal. The joke is a classic underdog story. We are programmed to root for the little guy. The image of the tiny wren outsmarting the magnificent eagle is inherently funny and satisfying. It's a story about the subversion of expectations. The powerful are not always as powerful as they seem, and the weak are not always as weak. This theme would have had a very powerful appeal in the rigidly hierarchical society of the Middle Ages. The feudal system was based on a clear pyramid of power. At the top was the king. Below him were the great nobles, then the lesser knights, and at the bottom was the vast majority of the population, the peasants. Your station in life was determined by your birth. If you were born a peasant, you would almost certainly die a peasant. There was very little social mobility. A story like this offered a fantasy of escape from that rigid system. It suggested that even if you were small and powerless, you could still win if you were clever enough. It's a deeply subversive message. It quietly questions the idea that might makes right. The eagle has the power, but the wren has the legitimacy, because it won the contest according to the agreed-upon rules. It's a story about finding the loophole. This fable appears in many cultures. It's found in the writings of Aristotle in ancient Greece and in the folklore of countries all over Europe. In some versions, the wren is called the king of the birds. The story was so well known that the great 13th century scholar and scientist Albertus Magnus wrote about it in his book on animals, De Animalibus. He treated it as a piece of natural history, a true account of bird behavior, which shows how blurred the line could be between folklore and science. The joke is also a political allegory. The eagle is the king or the powerful lord. The wren is the clever courtier, the advisor, the lawyer, or even the jester, who uses his wits to survive and thrive in a world of powerful men. He can't compete on their terms, so he has to change the game. This was a reality for many people in medieval courts. Your survival depended not on your strength, but on your ability to be clever, to be diplomatic, and to know when to speak and when to hide in the feathers of a more powerful man. So, what are the big historical questions that this joke raises? How did actual medieval kings and nobles react to stories like this? Did they see them as a harmless piece of fun or as a subtle challenge to their authority? The role of the court jester is interesting here. The jester was often the only person who could speak truth to power, disguised as a joke. Were stories like this a more widespread version of the jester's function? And did these stories ever inspire actual acts of rebellion, or were they simply a fantasy, a way of making an oppressive reality a little more bearable? Number 4. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Here is the joke. A man with only one arm came to the city gates. The gatekeeper, a notorious stickler for the rules, told him, "The toll for entry is 10 claps of your hands." The one-armed man looked at the gatekeeper, then at his single hand, and walked away. He came back a few minutes later with another one-armed man. He said to the gatekeeper, "We've come to pay the toll together." This is a joke about creative problem-solving and malicious compliance. The gatekeeper is being deliberately cruel and unreasonable. His demand is impossible for the first man to meet. It's a bureaucratic obstacle designed to exclude or humiliate him. The gatekeeper represents the mindless, petty tyranny of rules and regulations. He is a job's worth. The one-armed man's solution is brilliant. He doesn't argue. He doesn't complain about the unfairness of the rule. He accepts the rule and finds a way to follow it to the letter. He finds another person in the same situation and they cooperate. Together they can produce the 10 claps. The joke is in the beautiful, simple logic of his solution. He has turned the gatekeeper's absurd rule into a moment of cooperation and solidarity. The image of the two men clapping with their single hands is both funny and poignant. It's a visual gag, but it's also a powerful symbol of mutual support. The joke celebrates the idea that people with a shared problem can achieve more by working together than they can by themselves. It's a very humanistic and hopeful message. This joke also gives us a peek into the realities of medieval city life. Cities in the Middle Ages were walled for protection. Entry was controlled through gates. And yes, there were often tolls to be paid. These tolls or customs duties were a major source of revenue for the city. The gatekeeper was an important official. He was the city's first line of defense and its customs agent. The records of medieval cities are full of regulations about who could enter, when, and what tolls they had to pay. So the situation in the joke is a very realistic one. The joke is also about disability in the Middle Ages. Life was hard for people with disabilities. There was no social safety net. If you couldn't work, you often had to rely on charity or begging, but they were a visible part of society. The idea of two one-armed men finding each other in a city is not far-fetched. This joke treats the one-armed man not as an object of pity, but as a clever hero. He is not defined by his disability, he is defined by his intelligence. He is the protagonist, and the able-bodied gatekeeper is the fool. What are the big unanswered questions here? We know there were tolls and regulations, but how much room was there for arbitrary cruelty from officials like the gatekeeper? Were there official channels for complaining about this kind of treatment? We also see disability portrayed in different ways in medieval art and literature, sometimes as a sign of sin, other times as a path to holiness in the case of saintly suffering. How did the average person on the street actually treat people with disabilities? Was it with the contempt of the gatekeeper or with the solidarity shown by the two one-armed men? Number 3, what do you say to a naked man? Here is the joke. A man who was famously long-winded was robbed on the road. The thieves took everything, his money, his horse, even his clothes, and left him naked in a ditch. He eventually managed to crawl to a nearby monastery and knock on the door. A monk opened the door, saw the naked, shivering man, and asked, "Who are you and what do you want?" The man, instead of asking for help, launched into a long story. "I am a traveler who was beset by villains of the most nefarious kind. They descended upon me with malevolent intent, and after a lengthy and brutal struggle, in which I acquitted myself with no small amount of valor, I was finally overcome by their superior numbers." The monk, seeing that the story was going to take a very long time, simply said, "Brother, could you please first tell us whether you were robbed before or after you took your clothes off?" This joke is about a very specific and annoying type of person, the one who never gets to the point. The humor comes from the monk's dry, witty interruption. The naked man is in a desperate situation. He needs food, shelter, and clothing. But his own vanity and his love of hearing himself talk are more important to him than his immediate needs. You can't just say, "I've been robbed, please help me." He has to frame it as an epic saga in which he is the hero. The monk's question is a masterpiece of passive aggression. It's a polite and slightly absurd way of saying, "Shut up and get to the point." The question, "Were you robbed before or after you took your clothes off?" gently pokes fun at the man's storytelling. It highlights the gap between the man's dramatic narrative and his ridiculous, naked reality. The monk is a character we can all relate to. We have all been trapped by a long-winded storyteller and wished for a clever way to interrupt them. This joke comes from the Facetiae of Poggio Bracciolini, and it feels very modern. It's a comedy of manners. But it also connects to a long tradition of Christian teaching about the sin of pride. The naked man is guilty of vanity. He is more concerned with his reputation than his survival. The monk, on the other hand, represents monastic values of simplicity, directness, and humility. Monastic rules, like the rule of Saint Benedict, which dates from the 6th century and was the model for Western monasticism, place a great emphasis on controlling one's speech. Monks were often expected to keep silence for long periods of the day. Idle chatter was seen as a spiritual danger. So, for a monk, a long-winded man was not just annoying, he was sinning. The joke also plays on the stereotype of the sheltered monk versus the worldly traveler. The monk is supposed to be naive, but here he is the one with the sharp wit and the grasp of the situation. The traveler is supposed to be a man of action and experience, but he comes across as a pompous fool. The roles are reversed, which is a classic comedic device. What are the big historical unknowns? We have the official rules about monastic silence and speech, but how was it really practiced? The fact that a man like Poggio, a papal secretary, was telling and writing down jokes like this in the Vatican itself suggests that the reality was much more talkative and humorous than the rules might suggest. How did monks use humor among themselves? We have hints of it in the margins of manuscripts, where they would draw funny doodles, but what were their spoken jokes like? And was there a recognized social protocol for interrupting someone who was talking too much, or was the monk's clever jab a rare moment of wit? Number 2. What is a husband's greatest fear? Here is a very short joke. A man asks his friend, "Do you know what my wife and a magistrate have in common?" The friend says no. The man replies, "When they fall asleep, they are both harmless." This is a classic piece of medieval misogyny, but it's also a joke that reveals a deep-seated anxiety about power. Let's break it down. The two figures being compared are a wife and a magistrate. A magistrate is a judge, a figure of immense legal power. He can fine you, imprison you, or even sentence you to death. He is a person to be feared and respected. The joke puts a wife in the same category. It suggests that a wife, in her own domestic sphere, wields a similar kind of absolute and terrifying power over her husband. The punchline, "when they fall asleep, they are both harmless," is funny because it's a moment of relief. It's the only time the husband feels safe. The joke paints a picture of marriage as a constant state of low-grade warfare, a battle of wills in which the husband is usually losing. When his wife is asleep, there is a temporary ceasefire. He can finally relax. This is a very different view of marriage from the official one preached by the church, which saw it as a holy sacrament and a partnership. It's also different from the romantic view of courtly love found in literature, where a knight would perform great deeds for his lady. This is the view from the trenches. This is marriage as a power struggle. The joke is, of course, from a male perspective. It plays on the stereotype of the nagging, scolding wife, a figure who appears in literature and art throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. But why was this stereotype so persistent? Perhaps it was a reflection of a social reality. In a world where women had very little official power, The home was one of the few places where they could exercise authority. A woman ran the household, she managed its finances, she raised the children. For a man, coming home from a world where he might be a low-status peasant or artisan, the home was a place where he was not necessarily the king of the castle. This joke is a way of coping with that reality. It's a way for men to complain about their wives in a socially acceptable way. By comparing his wife to a powerful magistrate, the husband is also, in a strange way, paying her a compliment. He is acknowledging her power. He is admitting that she is a formidable opponent. The joke is not just, my wife is annoying. It's, my wife is as powerful and scary as a judge. So what are the big unanswered questions? This is clearly a man's joke. What were the women's jokes about their husbands? We have very few written records of them because most scribes and authors were men. But they must have existed. What would a joke that compared a husband to a magistrate have sounded like? My husband and a magistrate are both full of hot air and think they know everything. We can only speculate how much of this humor was genuinely bitter and how much of it was affectionate teasing. And did telling a joke like this actually help a husband and wife to get along by letting off some steam, or did it just reinforce negative stereotypes and make things worse? Number one, can you trust your own eyes? Here is the joke. A man from a city known for its foolish people saw a well in his courtyard. He looked in and saw his own reflection. He ran to his wife and said, "There is a man hiding in our well. I think he is a thief." His wife came and looked in the well. She saw her own reflection and screamed, "You are right. And he has a woman with him, the harlot." This is perhaps the ultimate joke about human foolishness. It comes from the Philogelos and has been making people laugh for at least 1,500 years. It works on so many levels. First, there is the simple, childlike mistake of not understanding what a reflection is. It's a fundamental failure to grasp the laws of physics. It's funny because it's a mistake that no adult in the audience would ever make. It makes us feel smart by comparison, but the joke is much deeper than that. The second part with the wife is what makes it a work of genius. Her mistake is not just a simple failure of perception. It's a failure of perception that is shaped by her own insecurities and prejudices. She doesn't just see another person, she sees a harlot. She immediately jumps to the worst possible conclusion. She sees in the well exactly what she fears in her own life, an unfaithful husband. The joke is a perfect illustration of the idea of projection. The husband and wife are not seeing what is really in the well. They are seeing a reflection of their own inner worlds. The husband sees a thief because he is worried about his property. The wife sees a harlot because she is worried about her marriage. The well is a mirror, not just of their faces, but of their souls. This is a profoundly philosophical joke. It asks a very serious question. Can we ever see the world as it truly is? Or do we only ever see a reflection of our own biases and fears? It's a question that philosophers and theologians have wrestled with for centuries. St. Paul in the New Testament wrote, "For now we see through a glass darkly." He was talking about the limits of human understanding of the divine. This joke is a comedic, domestic version of the same idea. The husband and wife are seeing through the water of the well darkly, and they are getting everything wrong. For a medieval audience, the joke would have also been a simple story about the stupidity of people from a rival town. It's another fool town joke. But it's the best of the bunch because the foolishness it describes is so universal. We all have moments where our fear or our anger makes us see things that are not there. We all have a tendency to project our own insecurities onto others. This joke holds up a mirror to the audience and says, "Are you sure you're any smarter than the people looking into the well?" What are the profound questions that this ancient joke leaves us with? It was told for centuries before the science of optics was understood. So, for much of its life, it was a joke about a genuine mystery. What did people in the Middle Ages really think a reflection was? Was it a soul, a spirit, a trick of the light? The fear of mirrors and reflections is a common theme in folklore around the world. How much of that fear was based on a simple misunderstanding of physics? And the final, most troubling question, if our perception of reality is so easily distorted by our own emotions, as it is for the couple in the joke, then how can we ever be sure of anything we see?